In this episode of Thurston County Connection, Commissioner Gary Edwards meets with some of the partners that joined with Thurston County to restore the water quality of the Henderson Watershed.
Gary Edwards, County Commissioner here. Tris Carlson knows all about water quality. And here we are on the Henderson Watershed, and Tris is going to tell us a little bit about the history here and how we have put together a program. Prior county commissioners put this together to address water quality, and we've had some successes, and then the new commission has reauthorized what was put in place, and maybe Trish can fill us in on that, and maybe a little bit about yourself, Trish.
Okay, well, I'll give you a little background on myself. I'm a resident in Nisqually. I came on when the shellfish protection districts were initially formed back in 2001, and later on the two shellfish protection districts, Nisqually and Henderson, combined. So today they're known as a combined stakeholders group. And so we're going on just following up on adaptive management right now. But historically, Henderson Inlet was the first one that became apparent that it needed some help, because back in 1984 they started recognizing downgrades of a couple hundred acres at a time, and
these downgrades have to do with shellfish and water quality around the shellfish?
The State Department of Health has a requirement that fecal coliform bacteria levels be below a certain level, and when they go above a certain level, then they close those beaches for harvest. Once they close those for harvest, then of course operators or recreational people that you can't take the shellfish unless you take the possibility of getting sick. So when they change by a downgrade, they mean going from say an approved harvest site to a conditional harvest, whereas a half an inch or 1 inch of rainfall would in 24 hours would close it for some period of time.
That's because pollutants get flushed down into the water?
What we see is that in the lower inlet here, the Department of Health, they do monitoring once a month for fecal coliform bacteria. And so the idea is that if it meets the requirements, the state requirements for fecal coliform below a certain level, then it gets an approved status. If it takes a number of 30 samples, and over those 30 samples, if they're all below that threshold, you can get an approved status. But if they get a high hit, then it may change that description to a conditional approval rating, because it has then there's a greater tendency to get sick from the oysters. So, but the thing that you're up against is that one high hit has to come off of that matrix. So it takes, at once a month, it takes 30 months for that high hit to come off of that.
Part of that average, maybe? Is that
they have what they call, they do have an average, but if the average gets above, I think it's 43, a count of 43 bacterial counts or colonies per 100 milliliters, then on an average, then it becomes a change in the status of the growing area.
Do you happen to recall what it might have been when the project was first started?
I don't know what the exact numbers are. Those are available.
Too high, obviously.
Yeah, there's down here in the lower inlet, they get a lot of flushing when we have rainfall events we'll get bacterial loads from the rainfall events, and then that will cause closures occasionally. The lower inlet is a difficult place to be in here. It's as we can see, the Nisqually Shellfish Farm is here, and about half of their 300 and plus acres is I think in a conditional approved rating right now, just because of the fact that we're continuing to try to identify bacterial loads and where they're coming from.
Now, do you get any bacteria from, just as an example, Victoria, British Columbia? It's my understanding that they pump about 40 million gallons of raw sewage a day into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and there's a certain flush that I'm sure it takes a long time for any effect to get here. But every day for the last 100 years, that's got to have some effect on what goes on, and we're trying to overcome any type of wash from the north and take care of all the water that comes from the south into the Henderson Watershed.
Yeah, it's probably, yeah, it's unlikely that the fecal coliform from that kind of an outfall would reach down here because the transport time would be so long that
It'd be killed in the,
they wouldn't be they wouldn't survive the
ultraviolet
trip.
or something?
Yeah, they would. Well, they just wouldn't survive the transport and the time. We see the same thing here. Even the transport, from surface bacterial loads. If you have about 100 to 150 feet of raw land that runs across, it pretty much cleans it up. But there again, if it hits into a ditch or somebody decides to cut a ditch, then it gets right into the water, and then you have a problem.
Without a Mother Nature's barrier, so to speak.
Correct. Yeah, but historically, in 2001, there was a major downgrade that triggered a state law that required a shellfish protection district to be formed. And that's when the Henderson Inlet and the Nisqually Reach Shellfish Protection Districts were formed. And there was 11 committee members on each district board, and we came together, and our task was to put together a matrix on how to correct the fecal coliform problems. And we came up with a number of topics that we thought that were important to recognize and to research to find out if we could take those topics and correct the problems in each of those areas, within those areas being on-site septic systems, agriculture, land use, wildlife, and stormwater. And as you all know, the septic O&M program was initiated and has been one of the successful items down here. And so right now we're just doing adaptive management in the program and taking a look at what are the current monitoring reports look like, how much are we improving, are we falling back, is it staying steady, and then if we see a problem occurring like we are right now on the southeastern shore here, where we've gone from a conditional to now a restricted status, or it will be pretty soon, it'll be restricted, that we've already initiated starting a PIC program, which is a pollution identification and correction program, to try to identify where that pollution is coming from in that restricted, soon to be restricted area. The idea is that if we can focus on some of the upland creeks, because we have to remember that Woodland Creek that feeds the lower end of the bay here comes right out of the city of Lacey. And they've done just fantastic work in their stormwater business over there to clean part of that up. They did the Woodland Creek Estates refit on the septic systems to a step system that took was 167 homes or something like it. It was over 100. It was a large number of homes that were on septic systems in basically in urban densities where the buildings were, and they are now off the grid, and we saw immediate results from that. So those are the kinds of things we're looking at to control. And stormwater, like I say, with the city of Lacey, they've done a great job there in correcting some of the things that flowed into Woodland Creek. The county stormwater water resources division has done all the retrofits on the infiltration galleries along Martin Way and in the areas, the Tanglewild area that was feeding the Woodland Creek areas, because they were plugged, and so the water was just flowing right down the creek or right down the roads. The contaminated water was just rolling right down the streets and in the conveyance and then right out, because they weren't going into the infiltration galleries. And so they corrected that. So there was a lot of effort from the county stormwater to correct that. We have 5 projects up here at Woodard Bay. The county stormwater is doing retrofits to make sure that the stormwater conveyances are up to standards for conveying the water correctly. Nisqually had one over at Lure Beach, a major stormwater outfall that was corrected after quite some time. That's done some help. So there's lots of different things that are going on. The on-site septic system program that we're doing, taking the critical areas ordinance and refitting that to match not only the shoreline master program, but also to fit the water quality controls that the county is trying to do, so that we can get the sources from non-point, hopefully, to a point source.
It's kind of my understanding that although we haven't reached perfection yet, we've come a long ways towards correcting the problem. And isn't this kind of an example that Department of Ecology uses once in a while on how things can be adjusted and corrected if the right steps are taken?
I think the biggest thing that, in my estimation anyway, or in my view, the biggest thing is that we saw the entire population come together on the operation and maintenance for the O&M portion of the septic system law or rules that we have in Thurston County. And we saw ecology come together with the Department of Health, with Thurston County, with the City of Olympia, with the City of Lacey, and all these entities came together as a common cause and started working together. The idea was good, you know, as far as septic O&M or a stormwater capital facilities plan type of an action where you put projects into the melds that get done that are going to improve water quality directly. But all these entities came together and worked very closely together and started passing information, I think, maybe a little more frequently than they had before.
Well, the citizens also got involved and came together. And, you know, I don't know anybody that doesn't want clean water.
Correct.
It's just kind of how we're going to get there. But it's my understanding that through these creation of these different groups that you were involved in from the citizens level, they were also on board.
Yes, and some of the projects that we did, like the pet waste projects that Pacific Shellfish Institute put together, has been successful, and we've seen I see a lot more people out with their doggy bags, you know, than I ever have seen in the past, and that has a lot to do with the public outreach that the different sources, and you know, actually the Thurston Conservation District I should give a plug to, because they're really the overall. They're the people that made this thing happen. You know, the funds that come from the citizens that own parcels in the Nisqually and the Henderson Inlet water basins or basins. The Thurston Conservation District allowed to take those dollars and direct them to projects and public outreach in our specific watersheds. So the citizens got behind that and said, wow, if you're going to spend our money here, then we should be interested in it. And yes, I think the public stood back. And I've asked my neighbors, you know, what do you think of these programs? And they think they should have been done earlier, because we find that when you see positive results, then the public can get behind it. As you well know, the public always thinks that the government spends more money than it should. But the fact is that
we hear that
it's been well spent down here. It's been very well spent.
Good example.
And not only that, I think we've gotten national exposure on our operations and maintenance for septic systems. That different jurisdictions across the country have been calling the county and asking them, "What did you do?" And
well, we have a long way to go yet. I mean, I've got some examples on water quality that I'm really scratching my head about, and that is like Indian Creek that flows into Capitol Lake. Mm-hmm. There's a homeless encampment on Indian Creek, and there are probably 100 people in there, and it's in a wetland, and that's where they're living. Well, you know where the toilet is. There isn't one.
Correct.
And it's showing up when it goes into the lake, and yet the people that own the property are not allowed to develop it properly because it is a wetland. So we have conflicting goals here, and it seems like when there's that's what I talk about bureaucracy. It seems like the bureaucracy doesn't allow for common sense to come into play and say, okay, we should be able to do what's least damaging to the environment, and what would that be? But that's not written in the code, so it's hard to figure all that stuff out.
Yeah, we just had that discussion about homeless camps for as a focus for the Henderson Inlet watershed here. In that, we're trying to identify other pollution sources that we haven't addressed yet, and homeless camps is one of those items that nobody really tracks. So we put that into the mix, and as to in our adaptive management plan to see whether or not that's something that we want to get some exposure to. Because if we do have that, then we want to also get involved with the social services to see how we can work together with social services to try to come up with some sort of a plan that would not only help the homeless in what they're doing, but also clean up the environment around where they live or where they're going to be living.
Yeah.
So, but those are all ongoing things that we're trying to work on.
Ongoing challenges.
Yeah,
that we
ongoing
have in
challenges,
government.
yeah.
That's right. What can you tell us about some of the shellfish restoration program that has to do with water quality, and I think some of the successes that we've had right here?
Well, of course, oysters are the canary in the cage in the mine, and one of our partners that has been participating in the Shellfish Fund with the Shellfish Protection Districts is the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, which has a restorative oyster farm that they do joint venture here with the Nisqually tribe, and what they're doing is putting Pacific oysters out, and they're selling them, and they're taking that money along with the money that they get from the Thurston Conservation District through the Shellfish Fund, and they're bringing down children for public outreach, and they bring down, I can't remember how many bus loads, but it was
For field trips.
for field trips, and they I think that they're working mostly with Camachin Middle School, and there's maybe another middle school too that they're working with, but they bring down bus loads of kids down here to go through and talk about shellfish restoration, the Olympia oyster, which they're trying to do a restoration here of the native oyster here, and they're having some success, but it's a very difficult place to work in because there's limited access. It's very muddy. It gets hot in the summertime, so you can't harvest. Yeah, but they seem to be able to, with the tribe and the Restoration Fund, they've done a very good job of bringing oysters back into the lower bay here and showing that they can grow in here and survive and do well. Actually, the oyster that the tribe grows right here is a delicious, very fast-growing oyster. There's plenty of nutrients, lots of food down here for them to eat in the summertime. They have a hard time harvesting, which is because it's too hot, but they do grow well, and it's a very fine product when it comes out. So the restoration is this. We see other people that are doing their own little hobby farms. They're starting to say, hey, I can do this too. And so we see, well, you can see across the way here, and then as you go up the bay, up there, there's more people that are just doing their own little farms. And hopefully this
For their own personal use?
Mostly for personal use.
Yeah.
There's a few other shellfish farms that are commercial, but the tribal one here and the Restoration Fund are the two big oyster growers down here that are really the ones that will show the results. You know, the results of how fast they grow, how clean the water is around them. It's actually. I'll give you a little background. Jerry Yamashita, I sat with him one time, and he's now 94, but this must have been 2002. I sat down with him and said, we're going to get this water cleaned up, because he still owned the property down here in Western Oyster. And he says, and he was very depressed, he said, I've been working at this 25 years, and I don't think we're ever going to get it fixed. And I was, of course, a lot younger in those days, and I was feeling pretty good. Oh, we'll get it fixed, we'll get it fixed. And I find out 16 years later what it takes to get it fixed. And but we did. It's mostly fixed. We still got some places to work on, but the majority of his old farm is now in the approved area. And so that's a real to me. That's the restoration I'm talking about, is bringing back something that was a very active farming operation. It was depressed because of the pollution, and now it's back to being a productive farm again.
Well, I want to take just a moment, because I don't know where this segment's going to go, but I want to thank you for all your effort that you've put into this, because you've been instrumental in accomplishing this type of restoration, if you will. And
the plug should go. The plug should go also to the Thurston Conservation District, because they stepped up. They really stepped up with the funds and allowed the committees to do the work that needed to be done, and the successes belongs really to not only TCD and the people that were on the committees, but all the staff of all the different agencies that have worked together so closely and still continue to work closely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
You bet. Thanks.
We're going to talk to some other folks from that Puget Sound Restoration Fund and see what they've got to say about this same type of activity, just to follow up on what you're filling us in on now.
Yeah, they're doing great work. They're a resource to the county.
Okay. Well, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Well, here we are. We just finished up talking to Tris Carlson, and here we are on Cliff Point. And Bob Mortenson's going to fill us in a little bit about what's been going on here. He's lived here since, I believe, 1986, but the family's had it for a much longer period of time. And we're talking about water quality, and Bob's been a beneficiary of what we've put together, or prior county commissioners put together, and then recently we extended that ordinance. So Bob, could you tell us just a little bit about your involvement here, maybe as a citizen, and how this has benefited you?
Okay, well, I came out here in 1956 when I married a beautiful brunette from Sumner, Washington. I came from northern Michigan.
Oh yeah.
And we lived in Seattle, moved to Bellevue, moved to Tacoma, and ultimately ended up here. But my wife, Janet's family, bought this property in 1933 and built a summer cabin. The family lived in Sumner, Washington. And Stan, my father-in-law, ran a bulb farm, Stats Bulb Farm in Sumner. Any rate, this was a summer hangout for the kids and the family. And of course, I wasn't on the scene all those years.
Yet, huh?
But as I told several people, when they first built the cabin, there was no septic system around. The whole system went directly into the bay, as I understood it. Of course, I wasn't here, but and that was for quite a while. I'm not sure how many years, but that was the way that it was handled, as I understood it, throughout
Sure.
the inlet. Any rate, that system became a regular conventional septic system. We were living in Seattle at that time, and Janet and I. So this was a summer hangout for the family. And as the family evolved and passed on, Janet ended up with this particular property, and her in-laws have other adjacent property right next door here. So it's been in the family now since 1933, and I hope to keep it that way.
Yes.
So we had a major remodel of this cabin, summer cabin, to the conventional or present site in 1986. And our son, ironically, was the architect.
Oh yeah.
And well, when I say ironic, it's a family story and it doesn't need to be appropriate.
We don't have enough time for it today. Maybe later.
At any rate, Paul, our son, is the architect that converted this to a year-round home. And Janet and I moved here in 87. So we've had a major renovation of the cabin, a major renovation of the septic system. We've been involved in raising clams, steamer clams, and now gooey ducks for quite a few years. And so we're very interested in maintaining the quality of the water in Henderson Inlet. And we've tried to be good stewards.
Good stewards, yeah.
And supportive of management.
Well, you can see that we've come a long ways since 33, if you will, and we're hoping maybe we can take a look at your modern septic system in place today and how that all ties in with water quality, because all of us are concerned about water quality, and I think you've just got a prime location. I mean, you're close to the water, but yet you are a good steward of your property, and you've got a modern system that does protect water quality, and we'd like to take a look at it.
Well, you're more than welcome to do so. We have the septic system just below the cabin here, but the drain field is
Sure, pump up tight line to
Right.
farther away from the water. And,
Right.
Yeah.
and that system failed once, and we had to redo it and at considerable expense, but it was
Yeah.
all worth it.
Sure.
And, we're happy to have done it. So,
Yeah. When you say failed, it wasn't anything like went on in Seattle here about 6 months ago or so. We won't get into that.
okay.
Yeah. Okay, Bob, well, what's chances we could take a look at a modern system that's up to date, according to code, quite a change from what this property had in 1933.
Quite a change. And let's
Okay.
go take a look.
Okay. thank
Okay?
Here we are at Bob's modern septic system. Jane's going to introduce herself and give us a little background on what really is taking place here. But this is quite a change from when Bob's family had a septic system in place in 1933. And now we've got a modern system with an alarm, and we've got a tight line that goes to a drain field as far from the water as we can get it. In fact, it's up there about 500 feet, and we'll take a shot of that in just a few moments. So, Jane, why don't you tell us a little bit about how all this takes place?
Sure. Well, the way a septic system works.
And a little bit about yourself, if you would, please.
Oh, okay. Well, I work at the health department, and I manage the septic operations and maintenance program of the county. And so that's the program for Henderson and Nisqually marine recovery areas, or shellfish protection districts, where folks have to have their systems inspected regularly and turn that inspection in to the county health department so we can make sure everything's working okay. So this system needs to get inspected every 3 years, and you can either do that by hiring a septic professional to come out and do that test, which I believe is what you've done.
Yes, I have.
And then you can also take a class that we offer that's free. It takes a good part of a day, about 5 hours or so, and learn how to do it yourself and become certified to do your own self-inspection. So I could talk about that a little bit.
And then it's cost-free from that point on.
And then it's cost
And the class is cost-free, right?
Yes, and so doing the inspection is cost-free. At some point, septic systems do need to get pumped, and so you still have to pay for the pumping, and the pumper needs to, take care of the waste in an appropriate manner.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, how about if we let you just go ahead and finish up here, and Bob and I'll go over here and watch what's happening.
Okay.
What do you think? Why not?
Well, most modern septic systems have what's known as a 2-compartment tank. So you can see the riser lids right here. And the sewage comes from the house into the first compartment, which is rather large, and it comes down and it has a chance to settle out. And that's the main job of the septic tank, is to settle out the solids and the scum, the floaters and the sinkers for that matter. And what you want is a lot of clear liquid in between. And then it can pass over a baffle and come to a second compartment and have a second chance to do that settling. And the reason for that is you really, really want to protect the drain field. As we mentioned, the drain field is about 500 feet up, and that's what failed before when he had a septic failure. If the drain field gets clogged, then you need to start over, and that's a very expensive repair. So you really want to keep things in the septic tank, give it a chance to settle, and then you periodically need to go through and inspect it. And that's what we require now every 3 years for most people in the Henderson and Nisqually shellfish protection districts. And you can use a stick like this, and we have directions on how to make it. And you would take off the lids, or if you didn't have lids, you have to dig it up, and that's pretty hard. And then you would go over to the inlet side, and you'd put this there, and you'd rest it right on top of the scum layer. You'd push through, turn the hook, and pull it up and measure on the bottom of the scum layer, and that amount of inches is how much scum you have. And then you get the second part of the stick, you push it all the way down to the bottom, and we like to have a little, I guess I'll show you this. Push it all the way down to the bottom and measure how deep the tank is, and then measure the sludge layer. And again, what we'd have is a little bit of Velcro on this, and the sludge just sticks right to that Velcro. So it's not a job that everybody really enjoys doing, but it is something that homeowners can learn to do. You take that out, and then you add the scum and the sludge together, and we want it to be no more than 1/3 of the whole depth of the tank to make sure that there's enough of that clear zone in between. Again, because what we really want is for the solids to stay in the tank and not get out to the drain field. That's where we get into troubles. So folks do this, they submit that report to us at the health department, and our sanitarians look it over. And if it needs to be pumped, then people have to arrange for pumping and get that taken care of. The other really important things that we're looking at are all the components of the system. So is the inlet baffle doing okay? Is the outlet baffle okay? Outlet baffles tend to get corroded because there's a lot of gases inside the septic tank that can corrode away at the cement that's there. And so this is one of our most common repairs when we have repairs needed, is where this pipe goes out, it's corroded away enough that the sewage is leaking out the tank instead of going out to the drain field like it's supposed to. So I'd say about 50% of our repairs is that. And that's a pretty simple repair if you know what's going on. And then the next thing that we have in this particular system is a pump chamber. So it's basically like another little mini septic tank, except that it has a pump in it, and that's the pump that then gets the sewage clear up to the drain field 500 feet uphill. You would also do the same kind of inspection there, and you'd also make sure that the pump is working. And most pumps have an alarm so that if something goes wrong, the alarm comes on and you're alerted to that fact, and you can do some investigation and take care of that before it overflows or becomes a problem.
Jane, maybe you could tell us just a little more. You mentioned the classes earlier. Mm-hmm. So the citizen participation and how successful that has been. And then you made some mention of a dye test, and maybe you could explain to the folks how that dye test was so important initially, and that the success there, and then I think we made some adjustments in the ordinance because of that.
Sure. Well, the classes were a big surprise to us because honestly, not everybody wants to get that personal with their sewage, and inspect it. So we offered classes starting 10 years ago or so in 2007, and we figured we'd do maybe 3-4 a year. It was so popular the first several years, we probably did 15 to 20 classes a year, and we've continued doing them more or less once a month ever since, and we've had about 2,400 people come through the classes and get certified to inspect their septic systems. So that's pretty impressive. And then you're right, when we first have gone into an area, including in Henderson, and do dye testing is a thing that we do to check the system to see if it's failing. So we come in and we put out some charcoal packets out in the environment. We pour dye down the toilet in a sink somewhere, and we come back for the next several weeks to pick up the packets to see if it's caught any dye. And using that method, when we first come into an area, when we first came into Henderson, it's not unusual to get 14 to 17% of a failure rate of the septic systems. But what we found is that over the years, with the regular inspections and people pumping more regularly and looking after it and finding the things like the broken baffles and finding issues while they were still small, is that failure rate has dropped quite a bit to now we're below 2% here in the Henderson watershed. So looking at that, again, once people are routinely inspecting their systems, we felt like we could increase the time between dye tests. It used to be every 6 years, and now we've gone to moving it to every 9 years. We're in a transition period, so okay. Some will be 6 and some will be 9 while we get the numbers all sorted out. And that way we freed up, thanks to you all, we freed up a little bit of staff time and money to be able to do more particular pollution investigations. So we have, say, an area out in Henderson Inlet in the marine water quality stations that are that are failing now, that were wavering and they've gone over the edge. So we need to go and look more in depth to see what's the problem, and that gives us that staff time to track down how much of it is coming from sewage, how much of it is coming from animal manure, how much is coming from kind of a new issue is wildlife, people feeding raccoons and whatnot, and getting a lot of animal manure piling up.
Lawn fertilizer must have some effect on it.
Lawn fertilizer doesn't
not as much as
well, it doesn't add to fecal coliform problems. It
okay,
adds
yeah,
to
just for that. It's a nutrient
to
thing,
nutrient
yeah.
situations. Yeah. So yeah, we've over the years, again, we have about 6,700 septic systems in Henderson Inlet. A number changes, of course, every year as new houses get built or cabins get converted. And about 86% of them are in good standing with their septic systems.
And that's way above average.
That's very
isn't it?
much, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
the health, I understand the health department and ecology kind of use us as an example once in a while.
They do, yeah. We're considered one of the best operating septic operation and maintenance programs in the area. I would say the rest of the county that doesn't have a required operational certificate to renew and have to inspect their system, they're at about 25% of being current in inspections. So that seems to make a big difference. And we're finding many more small repairs that get done now because of the requirement to inspect the system. We're able to find problems while they're still small, get them taken care of, and have less of the full-on failures to have to replace a whole system. Well, what's really exciting about the whole thing is it works. We really have improved water quality in Henderson Inlet. We've gained back about 366 acres of shellfish beds because of clean water improvements. It's a combination of the septic operations and maintenance, of stormwater improvements, of farmers making improvements to their manure handling. And we know that these things work because we've seen it here in Henderson Inlet. So that's really exciting. We'd like to keep that momentum going. It is an area that's seen increasing development. So we have not quite, but close to about 50% more people living here than when we started. And yet we've still been able to make these improvements. So that's a big success story.
Sure.
And I would say that's thanks to all of the citizens who have really done their part.
And I think it goes back to that statement I make quite often, that everybody I know wants clean water.
Sure.
So we've just come to ecology from over on Henderson Inlet with Jane, and she talked about the importance of clean water and how ecology is utilizing this clean water project as an example of how maybe others could proceed. And so here we are with Sally, and she'll introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her involvement in clean water and her history in clean water. And so here we are at the Department of Ecology with Sally, and she'll fill us in on what clean water means to the rest of the state in this example. Sally.
Great, thank you, Gary, very much. Welcome to the Washington Department of Ecology's building here in Lacey, Washington. This is within Henderson Inlet and the watershed that feeds the inlet. And it's a pleasure every morning when I walk in from the parking lot to the field that I get a chance to hear some of the sounds of this great watershed. This morning there was red-winged blackbirds and woodpeckers working out there, and there's some days we get alerts that watch out for coyote or cougar. So this little piece of the watershed that feeds into this bigger part of the watershed is something I enjoy every day, and it's great to have you here today. The Department of Ecology is involved in protecting clean water and working with partners to protect clean water and to strive for ways that we can prevent pollution every day that we're here at work. And that's because we know clean water is so important for you, for me, everyone that lives here, our communities, our families, the critters, the salmon that actually come into our urban streams here up Woodland Creek, and important for the shellfish that our shellfish growers out in the inlet need. Water is just the source of what makes us a community and helps us live in a healthy, prosperous way. Clean water at the Department of Ecology is something that we work on through a series of laws, as well as through a series of relationships with our partners. We provide assistance in different ways. It might be financial assistance, which I know is something is near
and dear to my heart.
to your heart, but we also work as a technical resource. We think of ourselves as a science resource to, whether it be a county, another organization, to businesses that need help to understand what's at risk, to other elected leaders, as well as anyone who has questions. So we bring to the table some strong science and some understanding of the regulatory framework that can help us drive toward clean water.
And stemming from that, probably at least 10 years ago, this project got started here in Thurston County. Prior commissioners had the foresight to put this all together. We recently renewed that ordinance for the watershed. So we've enhanced it, and we're now talking about the successes, about water quality in general. Now we have a long ways to go, but I can tell you that we've made some real advancements. Earlier part of this segment, we talked to a gentleman out on the watershed that said that his cabin was built in 1933, and the septic system left quite a bit to be desired from 1933 to what he has today, which is a state-of-the-art septic approved system, and the drain field is actually tight-lined 500 feet back from the residence to a state-of-the-art pressurized drain field that in the end protects water quality. So we've come a long ways, but I think we've got a long ways to go yet.
Yeah, sounds like the kind of waste treatment system that anybody would be proud to have. And here in this conversation about clean water and how examples like that are being highlighted, I think about the work that has gone into what's called a water quality cleanup plan and approach. And that's something that we've been talking about, I think, for many years with our partners at Thurston County and elsewhere. The Clean Water Act, which is a federal law, sets up states to understand how clean are their water bodies and to set standards of how much pollution water bodies can actually sustain before they start to fail and start to harm people by people getting sick, or shellfish are no longer healthy to eat, or other kind of pollution problems. And here in Henderson Inlet, in the early 2000s, people were talking about how can we create a water quality cleanup recipe so that we can help get the watershed back on track to be trending toward clean water. Because what we found in scientific collections of water and other environmental samples is that we were actually not meeting the water quality standards that were set. And so with that opportunity under the Clean Water Act to create a water cleanup plan, we worked really closely, not only with your team, but with the cities, with other organizations, local landowners, farmers, the Conservation District, the Nisqually Tribe, shellfish growers, to figure out what could we do once we had diagnosed that we were having problems in water quality areas with dissolved oxygen. There wasn't enough oxygen in the water. Problems with temperature, the water was too warm, with problems with bacteria that can make us sick, and also problems with an improper pH. And so as we were sharing the science of those areas where there was problems, there were people on your team and other organizations saying, well, let's not wait till we have the final cleanup actions that we need to do. Let's get going now. And so hats off to the county, to the cities, the tribe, and others who started early on finding ways to take actions and to work with people to make changes. The water quality cleanup recipe was completed, I think it was in 2006. We submitted it to our federal agency that authorizes us to do this work and to verify clean water, or to work on getting clean water improved. That was the Environmental Protection Agency. They turned it around in a year and they approved this cleanup plan. And so what that did is it gave us the ability to get some more additional federal dollars to help go to work in the watershed. And you know, the work that had already been started was enhanced. There were more partners able to do more things because there was additional funds. And so things got tackled, like let's look more closely at stormwater fixes. And what we found is that by retrofitting some of these stormwater systems that were kind of a taxi cab for pollutants to get delivered straight into the inlet, we fixed those and we got rid of those. Big improvements, sampling shows improvements. There was improvements that were made to convert some areas that were on septic systems that not all of them were working properly. Let's hook them up to a sewer. And so we removed more pollutant sources getting into the watershed. And then there were people that just started doing more to actually care for their own septic systems and make sure they're working. People who had dogs and other kinds of animals that leave their little piles of poop around figured out, well, I really do need to pick up after my pet, even though I live in a pretty rural area. And again, people started doing other things too, like what can I do on this shoreline to help keep it as healthy as possible so it can filter pollutants? What else can I do to keep my livestock from, their poop getting into the water? So just every place you look, there were people just going to work, and that collective power and collaboration has turned things around.
I think that it goes to show that everybody that we probably know wants clean water, wants clean air, clean water, the environment to be pristine. So we need to figure ways out, and that's where it comes together with working together with other entities, whether it's the state, the city, the county. So we've got a lot of challenges, and I think we can do a lot better than what we've done. But on the other hand, we have done so much more here in Thurston County in conjunction with the Department of Ecology and coming up with solutions and good examples, because those examples are actually the tests that we've completed with that water to show that the quality is, maybe it's not exactly pristine the way it was 200 years ago, if it was ever pristine, but at least now the shellfish can be harvested. And I think Jane showed us some of the maps that show that different fingers going into the Puget Sound, different inlets going in, have now been improved tremendously. And our goal is to try and get those all on the good side of the list.
What you say rings so true, that we need to highlight where we have successes and we're making progress. And let's just keep thinking about how that actually is happening here in the Henderson Watershed, where that water cleanup plan that people contributed to, we got approved and people started doing all these actions. In 2015, our scientists went back out into the watershed, took more environmental samples, more water samples to say, well, let's do a report card. And I think because we've talked about this, is that the results showed that bacteria levels were dropping. And I'll say that again, the trend, the statistical trend in bacteria present in the water was on the decline. And that is something very, very few watersheds in all of Washington have been able to achieve as they've been going after trying to improve water quality. So in that sense, Henderson is not just an example for hope and to use as a role model for the great areas of Thurston County and the many watersheds, but for the whole state.
Sure.
And that's something that I think as an elected official for Thurston County, you can take to any gathering of your colleagues from around the state and be proud.
Well, I do have to give credit to those that came before me, because we didn't put this plan together. Other commissioners did in conjunction with the state. And so it's a team effort. And the way I like to look at it is we're all in this game together. And going back to what I said, we all want clean water.
Yes, no, that's true. There's another corollary that I would draw, that the work that is represented here in Henderson Inlet, with the idea of everybody believing they can make a difference, that by working together they can actually change the direction of something. I would just offer that as my own example of how recently there was an effort announced by Governor Inslee to look at how can we restore orca and salmon in a manner to bring them back to healthy levels, reverse the trends. And you know, the message that the Henderson Inlet watershed improvements show is that by people caring and making a difference, anything is possible.
Well, I want to take an opportunity to plug a program here in Thurston County when it comes to water quality salmon enhancement. We've taken on a process where we are taking culverts that are detrimental to fish passage and changing those culverts out, but we're not waiting until the regular maintenance cycle comes up. We are prioritizing which one of those culverts would do the best and give us more stream access for salmon, which in turn reflects back to the orca. And so we're picking off about 5 a year. We're using REIT funds to do this. And hopefully we'll get other folks to follow our lead, if you will, and do the same thing, because we can't do it alone, and we're all in this game together, and hopefully we'll get more people to participate. But we've got this in place this year. It's moving ahead, and I guess I would encourage others to follow our way of doing that.
Yeah. Taking the initiative to carry out those kinds of proactive programs will add value to all these other efforts going on. And I know that in talking with my neighbors in my neighborhood, I like to share with them some of the things that are going on that they may not understand actually in their backyard. And then they often ask, well, you know, Sally, what can I do? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I look at them because some of them have septic systems, and I say, when was the last time you checked your septic system? You know, and I've got a couple of neighbors with some great watchdogs, and I say, so when you're out on a walk, you're picking up after your pet. You know, and you know, I also encourage people to think about stormwater, which is something we haven't yet talked about yet in much detail. One of the big findings in the work that was done in the water quality study was finding that actually stormwater conveyed an enormous load of pollutants into Henderson Inlet, and that we found that by fixing those storm conveyance systems so that they no longer were a taxi cab of...
Sure, and we're doing that, settling ponds and,
yes,
and native plants that absorb some of that out.
There's so much we can do as it comes to how do we manage all that rain that falls and wants to run across the land. And I know Thurston County is a leader in many of those things as well. So there's so much that we as individuals, we as partners, we as organizations that can team up, seek funds to go and do things, we can accomplish a lot. And Henderson Inlet is the kind of poster child I've lately been using as I talk to people around the southwest region of Washington of what they can try to accomplish as well.
Well, thank you very much for your partnership, and we're all going to benefit from it.
Great.
Perfect. Nice.
Hi, I'm Commissioner Gary Edwards. Thank you for watching Thurston Community Media, your source of local information. Thurston County Connection, connecting you with your community.